Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another MACS Live Chat. My name is Steve Schaeber, and I'm the manager of service training for MACS Worldwide, the Mobile Air Conditioning Society. Like many of you are during this coronavirus pandemic, all of us here on the MACS staff are working from home and practicing social distancing to help flatten the curve. And part of that means we've had to cancel and postpone many of our spring AC training clinics. But we still want to do what we can to keep in touch with our members and provide training for the industry. And as part of that, we're producing these MACS Live Chats with some of our industry's experts. Today, I'm being joined by Tech Line Specialist and MACS training contributor, Richard Hawkins.
Thanks for the invitation, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Richard, we've both done tech support for a number of years, and you certainly were a mentor for me when I started working in this business. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for this.
Thanks. You're certainly welcome.
During one of those first really tough calls that I asked you about, one of the questions that you asked me, which by the way, I did not know to ask the caller at that time, was, what is the location of the service ports? And I really didn't understand the question at that time because I just thought, well, the high side service port is on the high side of the system and the low side service port is on the low side. And actually, I wondered for a second there if you knew what you were asking me about. But as it turns out, your question was very important. And I've asked it countless times since then, and hopefully educated many technicians about why that question is so very important to know. And just as a follow-up to that, about a year ago, I was working on an article for Action Magazine, and I called you to ask, if you were an AC engineer at one of the OEMs, and you had unlimited resources, and of course, unlimited funds to do this, where is the ideal location to install service ports on an AC system? And is there ever a reason to have more than one?
Well, that brings up some very interesting questions there. You know, typically you don't think a whole lot about where the locations are of the service ports on a system. You just connect and, you know, everything's working okay. But it has significance when you have a situation where you got a vehicle that the AC system is not cooling properly on, or you getting some real unusual readings on your gauges and such. As far as the question about the ideal location for the service ports, in my humble opinion, I feel that the best place for the service ports are right at the compressor, right at the inlet and outlet of the compressor, so you can see exactly what that compressor is capable of doing pressure-wise. The further that you get away from the compressor, the more likely you are to run into a situation where you're seeing a reading that's not reflecting what the true pressure is at that compressor because of problems such as restrictions and so on. To further expand on this and answering the question about where would I want to put the service ports if I was able to do so, you're kind of asking me to come up with a service port wish list. So I would have a very extensive wish list. I mean, ideally, and you know, this is not real world, but ideally, you would want to have a service port on the inlet and the outlet of every component on the system, every line and every component. That way, you'd be able to read the pressure in a multitude of places and be able to easily isolate restrictions. I imagine that there's probably some people listening right now that can remember a time where they may have been working on a vehicle where they were faced with a very tough diagnostic situation, and they were looking at it and it's like, man, I wish I could read that pressure over there instead of over here. So my service port wish list would be very extensive.
So why is it so important to know where the service ports are located on the system?
Well, it's important because if you're dealing with some unusual pressure readings, most of the time you've got a restriction somewhere, and knowing exactly where you're reading the pressure helps you in isolating where the restriction is. And it's something that a lot of times inexperienced technicians have trouble grasping onto what you're really asking there. You know, I ask that question in a lot of tech calls, and generally the way I'll word the question is, okay, you've got some unusual pressure readings there. I need to know what the location, the precise location of the service ports on the system. And often I'll get an answer like, well, the high pressure service port is located up at the front of the car near the condenser, and the low pressure service port is located back near the firewall. Well, that's a very general answer. With regard to the condenser, I want to know whether it's on the inlet of the condenser or the outlet of the condenser. The fact that it's near the condenser, doesn't really tell me that. At the rear of the car where the suction port is, the low side service port is, I want to know if it's near the evaporator or if it's near the compressor. On an expansion valve system, on an orifice tube system, you got an accumulator back there. But sometimes they have a hard time understanding what you're really asking. So what I've done to try to explain that is say, okay, forget about the vehicle for a moment. I don't care about the vehicle. I don't care where the spring towers are located, or any of that. Just think of this air conditioning system as a road map. An air conditioning system is a closed loop. So just think of this as a map. And the major components like the compressor and the condenser and the dryer, et cetera, are like cities. And then we have the roads that are connecting the cities. So with regard to that service port up on the front there, is that close to the inlet of the condenser, or is it close to the outlet of the condenser? And then they kind of understand, what I'm talking about. I need to know, for example, if it's on the discharge line, I want to know if it's closer to the compressor or closer to the condenser. And once you explain it that way, they kind of understand what you're talking about, and they can help you zero in on exactly, where those pressure readings are taking place on those ports.
Right. Right. It's not helpful for them to tell you, oh, it's over near the battery.
Exactly. Okay, Steve. So, a while ago you were asking me about where I would locate the service ports if I had the ability to do so on a system, and also if I had the ability to put as many on it as I wanted to, where I would put them. But before we get into all that, let's just take a look at a typical layout here for an expansion valve system. Here we have an old-fashioned expansion valve system. It doesn't have anything showing up on there like a transducer or a high-pressure cutout switch or anything of that nature. It's just kind of a bare-bones system like you might use to teach a basic course on air conditioning operation. In this particular system here, we have our high-side service port that's located here just past the dryer, and we have our low-side service port, which is located over here just past the evaporator on the suction line. So let's say we had a situation where we had a vehicle come in that wasn't cooling very good. And we checked our pressures, and we had what appeared to be a normal high-side pressure. Let's say it's a 90-degree ambient temperature day, and we've got it running about maybe 180 or so on the high side, but the low side is only pulling down to about maybe 60 or so. Obviously, it's not going to cool very good. So, we're looking at that, and it's like, okay, maybe we've got a compressor that's not quite doing what it's supposed to. It's not pulling the low side down, but, the high side seems to be normal. Well, in reality, we could have a situation where the high side could be at 350 pounds or so, because we could have a restricted condenser and or dryer, and it's not going to show up because the refrigerant has to make its way through the discharge line up here, through the condenser, and through the dryer before it gets to the service port up here. If the service port was located at the compressor, we would be able to see what the true high side pressure was there at the compressor. So let's transition into my service port wish list here. Okay, so
wow.
With regard to my service port wish list here, let's do some counting. On the high side here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 high side service ports. On the low side, we have 1, 2, 3 low side service ports. And the way that those service ports are located there, they are strategically located where you can check the pressure on the inlet and the outlet of every line and every major component on that system. So in the example that we just used about the vehicle coming in with what appeared to be a pretty close to a normal high side reading, we could check our pressure right here and see our 180 pounds. We could go over here, check it to the inlet of the dryer, and if we had a restricted condenser, the pressure would show just about the same there. But if we went back up here to our compressor, we'd see we had abnormally high pressure. So we would know that we had a restriction somewhere between this point and that point. And we could go along further here and check the pressure there, and that would help us isolate the restriction in the condenser. In reality, you know, we can't do that because we're not going to have service ports in all those locations. And even if somebody was given a blank check to do that, you can't access all the locations because there's just not room on a modern car to do that.
Right. So now, even if you did have unlimited funds to put these service ports everywhere, I mean, isn't it really unnecessary though? Because, you know, I remember being taught in school that, you know, the engineers who design the vehicles, they consider that everywhere in the high side system, the pressure is the same. And likewise, everywhere in the low side system, the pressure is the same. So as long as you have a port in the high side and a port in the low side, you're going to get the reading that you need.
Well, in theory, those pressures really aren't going to be the same at every place in the low side. When you start moving a liquid or a gas through piping and so forth, the further that you get from the point where it's being pumped, the lower that the pressure is going to be. Now, it would take a gauge here, probably graduated in tenths of a PSI to see some of this, but just to kind of give you a good example of how you can get pressure drops. If anybody's done any painting, if you take a paint gun and you're supposed to have a certain PSI at the gun to properly atomize the paint, let's say it's 50 PSI. Okay, so with the paint gun trigger not pulled, your pressure is going to be the same at the compressor as it's going to be out there at the gun. But if you had a pressure gauge out there at the gun, and of course you've got your pressure regulator back at the tank, you pull that gun and you might see, depending on the length of the hose, as much as a 20 or 30 pound drop at the gun compared to at the pressure regulator. So you got to have the pressure regulator set a whole lot higher. So in this case here, you know, we're not talking about a 20 or 30 foot hose or anything like that, but the further that you get away from that compressor, the more pressure drop that you're going to see, particularly with the parallel flow condensers that we are using in today's world. These parallel flow condensers have these very small passageways in them. And in some testing that we did, actually in one of the temperature testing symposiums that we did a few years ago, you could actually see a pressure drop across the condenser by virtue of using a pressure transducer, which in that particular vehicle was located on the liquid line, and the high side port, which is located on the discharge line. At a low compressor displacement, we saw about a 4 pound difference, and at a high compressor displacement, we saw about a 12 psi difference. So you do get some variation in pressures. You're not so concerned about that, but where it really becomes a concern is when you have a badly restricted condenser or badly restricted dryer, and you're trying to pick up, and diagnose where those restrictions are. And of course, by not having the service ports everywhere like that, a lot of times you have to utilize temperature testing. But, you know, with a transducer, you can do some of what we're talking about here, you know, in checking pressures. And I've got another slide here we'll try to transition to. In this particular slide here, we've got a pressure transducer that's located up here on the discharge line, and we got a high side service port that's located down here just past the dryer. So we can easily, by looking at our transducer and looking at our high side gauge, determine how much of a pressure drop that we've got taking place through that condenser and dryer assembly there. Okay, so we've been talking about the multiple ports on the high side, the pressure transducers, etc. So let's back up a minute and talk about the low side. With this particular system here, we've got an old style peanut expansion valve, and there's enough room in there to put a service port between the expansion valve and the evaporator. In reality, nowadays, we'd probably be dealing with a block valve and wouldn't have that luxury. But on this system here, having this luxury, we could check and see if we might happen to have a restriction in the evaporator, which is very, very, very unlikely because we have the evaporator being protected by the filter that's in the dryer, and we can't get any big particles through the expansion valve. But we also have the luxury of checking the suction line, the inlet and the outlet of the suction line. And I've got a slide here that I think everybody will find very interesting. It involves doing a pressure check like that. So in this particular situation here, we've gone back to the slide that shows a high side service port just on the inlet of the condenser, and a low side service port over here on the suction line. This actually involved a vehicle where I was called upon to go into a shop a number of years ago to help a gentleman with a diagnostic problem. And this particular vehicle was a Honda around 2000, 2001, something like that. And this was the configuration on the service ports. This was a situation where he was extremely frustrated. He'd been working on this car for probably a week or more, and he had put multiple compressors on it. And I think he was probably on his second or third compressor when I happened to visit him, and he wanted another compressor. So I had pretty much knew what all had been going on because the manager of the warehouse had filled me in on it. But when I went in to visit him, I wanted to explain to everything that was going on. He's like, man, I just don't want to take the time to talk about this. He said, I want another compressor. I said, well, I understand, the situation that you're dealing with, but I'd like to hear a little bit about what's going on here. I want to help you with this problem. I said, so what exactly are you running into as far as your cooling and pressures and such? He said, it'll only run about 135 to 140 on the high side. It's only pulling the low side down to about 60 or 65. This was on an ambient temperature day, probably about 90 or so. So the high side pressure should have been much higher than that. It was a fixed displacement compressor. He said, the high side pressure should be a lot higher. And I'm like, yes, it should. So I proceeded to ask him, okay, what was the compressor that was on there before this one doing? Same thing. What was the compressor that was on there before that one doing? Same thing. What was the original compressor doing? Same thing. I said, well, okay, so you've had, 3 compressors on here, and this system is doing the same thing with all 3 compressors, right? He said, well, actually, I had another compressor on there. He said, I went to one of your competitors and bought one and put that one on there, but I had to take it off because it was leaking. He said it was doing the same thing. I said, well, what do you think the chances are of having 3 or 4 compressors all doing the same thing? The same thing wrong with all of them? I said, it's pretty unlikely. He said, but this compressor, he slammed his fist on the desk. He said, this compressor won't pump over 135 or 140 pounds. I said, well, you could have a restriction in the system. He said, no, I don't have a restriction. He said, if I have a restriction, I would have extremely high side pressure. I said, well, maybe depending upon where the restriction is, but a restriction can actually cause your high side pressure to be lower than it might be. So, let's go back and, let's see if we can do some diagnostics on it. Well, I've got it apart. I've got it taken apart. He said, but it doesn't have a restriction in it. He said, because I've blown through every line and component in it. And he said, there's no restriction anywhere. I said, well, blowing through lines and components is not the way to find a restriction. If you got a total restriction, yes, you can maybe find it by blowing air or flush or whatever, through components. But if you got a partial restriction, that won't necessarily show up. So he's like, okay, he's listening to me at this point. So what do I need to do? What would you do if you're working on this vehicle itself? I said, I would do some temperature testing on it. Well, what do you mean? I said, well, you've only got 2 places in that system where you're supposed to have an abrupt temperature change. That's at the compressor, the inlet of the compressor versus the outlet, and at the expansion valve, which is one of the dividing points in the system. Anywhere else where you've got any sort of abrupt temperature change would tend to indicate a restriction. Now, through a condenser on a fixed displacement system like this, you'll typically get about a 20 to 50 degree temperature drop, but that's not an abrupt temperature drop. So what I would suggest that you do is put the system back together, put the proper charge in it, charge it up, and do some temperature testing on it. Don't use an infrared gun. Make sure the infrared gun is securely locked away in the toolbox because they are extremely inaccurate. You need to use a contact temperature testing device where you can actually connect to the lines and the components and detect a significant temperature drop. If you don't have that, then you're better off using your hand. And what you might want to do is be careful obviously, but take a glove and cut the bottom portion out of it so that your hand is shielded from heat in the engine compartment. So he proceeded to do that. And the next day, he found that he did some temperature testing on the suction line, as well as other components, and he found that he had a significant temperature drop from this point versus this point over here going into the compressor. So that indicated that he had a restriction, and what he ended up having was this hose that we see on the left-hand side over here. If he'd had a low-side service port here at the compressor, he could have taken a pressure reading, and where he was seeing, 60 or 65 or so here coming out of the evaporator, it probably would have been, maybe 10 or less than that. So that would have indicated that he had a restriction. So that's where he utilized temperature testing to locate a restriction. Now, in discussing this hose right here, I had mentioned to him earlier that blowing air through a component wouldn't necessarily pick up a restriction. In this particular case here, this hose was almost straight. It was just a slight bend on each end. You could take that hose right there and you could blow air through it all day long and you detected no restriction whatsoever. You could pick that hose up and you could look through it and you could see daylight from one end to the other. But when you were looking through it, you noticed that something didn't quite look right on the inside. Instead of it being a nice circular all the way through, there was some irregularities in the inner liner of it. So I cut it open and you can see what had happened there. The inner liner had collapsed on it. Refrigerant was getting over behind the inner liner when the system was in operation. It was mashing it down and it was causing a restriction. So that's a perfect example of there where temperature testing paid off. He got another hose for it, hooked it up on there, pressures were perfect, and it was blowing 40-degree air. So, if we'd had two service ports on there, we'd had the ability to define that restriction, but obviously, he didn't have it. So temperature testing, came to the rescue there.
Wow, all that because of a collapsed liner.
Yeah, and, there's no telling how many hours he'd worked on this thing, and there had been 4 compressors put on it, and he was adamant about wanting to put another one on it. Now, obviously, he was a guy that was an inexperienced technician. There's probably most of the folks that are listening on this particular video here, certainly you wouldn't do that. But that's an example of what can happen sometimes when you're dealing with restrictions.
Right.
Okay, so we've been talking about expansion valve systems. Now let's shift gears and talk about orifice tube systems. Orifice tube systems are something that a lot of manufacturers are going away from, but there's still millions and millions of orifice tube systems out there that come into shops for service. So let's fast forward to the slide here about the orifice tube system. In this particular system here, we have a service port that's located high side service port that's located on the outlet of the compressor, and we have our low side service port over here on the accumulator. Now, going back to my wish list of service ports, I would have a total of, I believe there are 10 service ports on this slide right here. We've got 4 service ports on the high side, and we have 6 service ports on the low side. So again, that would give us the ability to check our pressures at multiple places on that particular system there. And we could easily locate a restriction by doing so. But of course, in real world, we don't have that luxury, but we can utilize our temperature testing.
Right. So really the point of having all these service ports is so that you can look at the pressure difference between the inlet and the outlet of all the different components in the AC system.
Exactly. If you have a situation where you have a restricted condenser, you could easily determine that by looking at the pressure differential from the inlet versus the outlet. If you happen to have a situation there where you had a problem with that accumulator, which the way an accumulator is constructed, it can't stop up typically like a filter dryer can, because you really don't have anything in there filtering refrigerant. But I have had a couple of situations I've run into over the years where somebody had a vehicle that was not cooling properly. They changed the accumulator and it started working okay. I tried to get my hands on those accumulators because I wanted to cut them open and just see what had happened, but I never could. But with those service ports on there, that gives you a lot of capability of checking pressures and finding restrictions.
Right. So now this actually looks familiar to me, at least down towards the bottom of this picture. I've actually seen vehicles set up that have the high and low side service port on either side of the orifice tube.
Yeah, Steve, GM came out with a configuration like that in the early 2000s on their pickup trucks, where the service ports were right there on the same line on each side of the orifice tube. And I remember the first one I ever saw. I looked at it and I'm like, wow, I've never seen anything like that before. The service ports right there on the same line. And after I thought about it a moment, it made, perfect sense. But again, I'd rather have my high side service port up here at the compressor, because if I've got some sort of a problem, I want to know exactly what the compressor is capable of doing.
Right. So I guess that just comes back to engineers figuring that the high side pressure is the same across the system, the low side pressure is the same across the system. That probably, and what's the easiest to do for manufacture and assembly.
Yeah, and it's a situation where most of the time it's not going to be an issue. Where it becomes an issue is when you have these restrictions and these pressures acting strange, and you're trying to pinpoint where your problem is.
Right. So we're not going to see vehicles set up with all of these service ports in reality, but are there any vehicles that have more than just a high and low side service port?
Glad you asked that question. Yes, there are. I have a slide here that illustrates that. Very common vehicle here, PT Cruiser. Let's take a look at port configuration on early PT Cruisers. Now, I realize that we're talking about vehicles here that 18, 19 years old or so, but there were tons of them sold and they're still out there. So right here, it says, what appears to be a typical high side, low side service port arrangement in the picture below isn't, and the result has been a lot of compressors and other parts replaced unnecessarily. So, here we've got two service ports side by side. So that's our low side service port right there. It's located on the suction line between the accumulator and the compressor. If you follow that line, it would run on down to the compressor. So now we look over here, and what appears to be a high side service port is actually a plant charge port. It's located between the orifice tube and the evaporator in the low side of the system, and it has a high side type connector on it. The orifice tube is staked in this liquid line back in this area right here. So it's on the low side, and a high side connector will connect right up to it. So,
wow.
yeah, wow. And
Really?
yes, sir. And I can't tell you how many situations I've run into where compressors and a lot of components have been replaced unnecessarily because of this. PT Cruisers have a lot of problems with cooling fans. Sometimes the cooling fan won't run at all. Sometimes they'll only run on low. So what happens is you'll have a cruiser come into a shop. Maybe you've got an inexperienced technician working on it. And if the cooling fan's not running all, they should pick up that they've got a problem with the compressor turning on and off, because the high pressure cutout switch is going to turn the compressor on and off. When it gets up to about 425 pounds, it'll turn it off. When it drops back down, below 300 or so, it'll turn it back on. So you'll see some rapid cycling, if you will. It's not really cycling. I think of cycling more of the low side cycling, but you'll see the compressor turning on and off rapidly. So that should be a tip off that you got a high pressure problem. But if you have a situation where you got a fan that's maybe running on low, compressor might not be turning on and off. There might be enough airflow to keep the pressure below the high pressure cutout threshold. So what you get there is a situation where maybe it's only capable of pulling the low side down to, let's say, 60 or so, because the high side pressures may be running at 375. So what happens is somebody connects a gauge up to the system. They connect their high side gauge to that plant charge port there. They connect their low side gauge to the low side service port, and they see pressures within maybe 5 or 10 pounds of one another. They're reading the pressure on both gauges in the low side. It'll tend to be a little bit higher over here than it will be down here because of the distance that the refrigerant has to travel. But they might look at it and they say, gosh, I've only got 65 pounds of high side pressure, and I've got 60 pounds of low side pressure. I've got a bad compressor because it's 90 degrees and I should have well over 200, maybe 200 pounds of pressure. So I've only got 65 pounds of pressure. So I've got a bad compressor. Well, what the question that they should be asking themselves, or they should be thinking about, okay, with ambient temperature at 90 degrees, if this vehicle is sitting still and hasn't been run and everything's at ambient temperature, I'm going to have a static pressure of somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 pounds or so. I don't have a PT chart here in front of me, but they should be thinking, okay, so we start this vehicle up and the high side pressure is going to drop from 100 or so down to 65. There's something wrong with that picture there, and that doesn't indicate a bad compressor. But again, we're talking about an inexperienced technician, so he goes ahead and installs another compressor on there. It's doing the same thing. So then they start replacing multiple components. They might, replace the condenser. They might replace the lines, the dryer. Sometimes I've run into situations, Steve, where they replace the whole system on the vehicle. And this is a pattern failure. And what I typically do when I'm talking to them is like, all right, what I'd like for you to do here is let's take this vehicle and get it close to a water hose somewhere. Have somebody help you. Let's start it up. As soon as you start it up, I want somebody misting some water on this condenser, and let's see what it does. I'll have somebody misting some water on the condenser. Pressures drop on down. It's blowing nice cold air. So cut it off. I said, we found your problem. What's that? You got a bad cooling fan. And it's like, golly, it's a bad cooling fan. It's, I can't believe that, we've replaced all these parts and all we've got is a cooling fan, but yet, they've maybe spent a week working on it and replaced multiple components, and it was a, fairly inexpensive cooling fan that was causing the whole problem. There's no telling how many thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of components that have been replaced because of the location of that plant charge port, which is masquerading as a high side service port. The true high side service port is located down next to the compressor on the discharge line, and it's very hard to get to. I've had some guys connect up to it when I was talking to them on the phone, and I've had them utter some very choice words when trying to connect to it. So that's a situation there where the decision to locate that charge port up there on the near the spring tower has caused some major issues.
Right. Now, it just amazes me that they didn't decide to stake that orifice tube past that high side charging port.
Well, that is pretty amazing. There's no doubt about that. But also something else that's sort of amazing is here is some information from all data, of course, from the factory on the 2001 Chrysler PT Cruiser that shows the location of the service ports. Number 5 is that charge port, and it states on there high side service port. So if somebody had looked in their information provider, that would be indicating to them that that was the high side service port that they were connected to. And that was corrected later on in a TSB. There was a TSB that came out that addressed it, that stated that that was the charge port, and that the true high side service port was located down on the discharge line. I thought I had a slide that actually showed that, but yeah, they corrected that in that TSB. But there's still a lot of guys that connect up to that charge port, and it creates a lot of confusion as a result.
Wow. So are there any vehicles that have only one service port?
Yes, there are. I can't give you specific models right off the top of my head, but I can remember that there were some European cars. Audi is one that comes to mind that only had one service port.
Wow. Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because I worked on a Jaguar recently. I looked all over the place, but all I could find was a high side service port. So side port, it might be somewhere, but I couldn't find it.
Well, you don't run into it much. And another vehicle that came to mind was a Volvo. Some of the Volvos from years gone by, only had one service port on them.
Right. Well, that's about all the time we have for right now. I'm sure that each of our members will appreciate the information we've covered in this webinar, and hopefully it can help them with a future diagnosis. And Richard, thanks for hanging out with me today for this live chat.
You're certainly welcome. My pleasure.
And of course, we'd like to thank you for your continued membership with MACS. To find out all that your association has to offer, including our affinity programs designed to help save your shop money, please visit our website at www.maxw.org. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Steve Schaeber.
And I'm Richard Hawkins.
And we'll see you next time.